system scientist community. So this is the first of a series of 5 webinars. And these 5 webinars are all centered around the question, how does science translate into policy, and kind of lessons learned from more senior people to move into a career in this field. And today it will focus on cities and in the context of the Urban Knowledge Action Network of Future Earth. And the next ones will be on oceans, natural assets, the web nexus, and sustainable consumption and production. And so these webinars are organized together with Future Earth and a collaboration of the Early Career Researchers Network of Networks, which is a kind of compilation of, or an umbrella function of around almost 20 early career scientists and researchers networks, all focused on sustainability science. And we had a great help of the Young Scholars Initiative in particular for this webinar series. And we came up to organize this series because we were thinking what binds together these networks, and we're all kind of interacting on this science policy interface in sustainability science. So we thought we can maybe learn more about this and make some really focused webinars in the next weeks. So we hope to see you also in the other webinars. And I hope that people had a chance to call in these minutes. And we first will start with a roundtable discussion for which we have 2 very good speakers. So I'm very glad to announce them in a little bit to you, which will last around maybe 30 to 40 minutes. And then there will be a chance for you to ask good questions. So, or nice questions, provocative questions, anything you want to know from the speakers that we have here today. Then just to briefly highlight, this webinar will also be recorded and possibly could also be shared on social media or websites later on, so just for your information. Then I'm very glad to announce the first speaker to you, which is Seth Schultz. And he's a special advisor on science and innovation to the Global Covenant of Mayors. And he previously was the Director of Science and Innovation at the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. And he was also a member of the development team of the Urban Knowledge Action Network of Future Earth. He's a very active man, and he also serves as a lead author at the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, which is coming out very soon. And he's more broadly working to raise international awareness on the role of cities in tackling climate change. So we're very glad to have you here today, Seth. Thank you very much for freeing up some time for this webinar. And then the second speaker, we have José Pumpim de Oliveira. He is a faculty member at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. And he's also a visiting professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, at the Fudan University in Shanghai, to Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Quito. He's an associate fellow of the United Nations University in Kuala Lumpur. And he has a very, very long-standing intertransdisciplinary expertise. And he's currently more focusing on the political economy of sustainable development, and very much related also to governance and how global institutions are interlinked to global governance. So that's also where the cities come more into play. So we're very happy to have you here, and we're very much looking forward to hear your perspectives. For the questions, attendees, please keep your questions in mind and type them in the box, in the chat box next to you on the right side for you, I think, most of all of you. And then we will collect them all and we will ask them in the end. So if you have already some good question, then please feel free to already add them to the chat box. Then I would like to start a roundtable discussion. And Seth, maybe we could start with you to maybe please briefly introduce the Global Covenant of Mayors to people. Maybe some are a bit less familiar with the network, as well maybe as your own role in the organization and some other activities that you would like to highlight in the context of cities.
Sure, great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. Been looking forward to this, so thanks for having me. So yeah, I've been working on city networks for the last decade. In the last 15, 20 years, there's been a big rise in terms of city networks globally and applied in different ways, either on social services, on healthcare, or in climate change. So in that regard, it's been a really exciting couple of decades to see the kind of explosion of the activity there and the proof of concept in terms of the model of cities working together to share information and challenges to, in this case, tackle climate change. Global Covenant of Mayors is an interesting evolution in that 20 years. So as the evidence and the impact of those types of activities became more apparent, more and more city networks started getting created, which is a good thing because there's lots of work that needs to be done. But it also created tens, if not dozens, of networks all over the world. And they all had slightly different approaches. They had different engagement models. They collected data differently. And at the same time, and I think we're going to get onto this a little bit more, as the role of the non-state actor. So any body that's not a national government, is their role, excuse me, became clearer and clearer in terms of the importance of tackling climate change via the Paris Agreement. The role of cities became even more important in that sense. But it became very difficult to engage with national governments and or through intergovernmental processes like the UNFCCC when all the work was fragmented and you couldn't compare information and data, and you didn't have as big of a lobbying block to influence international events like that. So the Global Covenant of Mayors was an approach to address that. And what it is, it's the first of its kind, largest global alliance of cities and city networks fighting and tackling climate change. So what you had is you had basically, it was a merger. You had something called the Covenant of Mayors, which was a coalition of city networks in Europe. And then you had the Compact of Mayors, which was 3 or 4 of the world's largest global networks. C40 was one of those. So the Compact of Mayors and the European Covenant merged to become the Global Covenant. And the Global Covenant now has I think it's over 9,000 cities participating in it. And it became a big negotiating block and lobbying block to engage with the UNFCCC. So a bunch of cities and networks are in that, but it's focusing on data dissemination, data architecture, governance standards. So that way you can get information and data in one place and also compare it. So that's a little bit about what Global Covenant is, and it's about 2 years old. So it's very, very new. When I was at C40, I helped create the Compact of Mayors and then played a role in helping merge those two together. And about 6 months ago, I stepped down from my role at C40 after about 5-6 years. And I'm now the advisor to the Global Covenant of Mayors, helping them create a brand new global initiative on Innovate for Cities. And it's basically a global research and innovation agenda on cities and climate change. So we did a bunch of work through Cities IPCC and some other things that I'll talk about to do a global lit review of where the science sits as it pertains to climate change in cities, identify the gaps, talk about some of the things that are most urgent in the next decade for us to generate knowledge on. And then in turn, for the last 6 months, I've been working with the Global Covenant of Mayors to take that and then kind of go through it with a pragmatic lens of implementation. So this is what the science says are the gaps in the literature and what needs to happen. But then here's what cities need to do and why they need to do it in the next 5 years. So this is what they're implementing, and this is what they need information to take sound science-based policy. So we've kind of merged those two together, and we're releasing this brand new global initiative in 2 weeks at the One Planet Summit with President Macron and Michael Bloomberg in New York City during the UN General Assembly, which is really, really exciting. So that's a little bit about the Global Covenant of Mayors and some of the stuff that I've been working on. Is that helpful, or would you like anything else?
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that gives a really good introduction of what you're doing right now and what your role is. And also, it's, I think, a perfect match with today's topic on the science policy interface. So I think we will come back in a little bit more in depth later on in the webinar. So maybe Jose can possibly also give a little bit of brief introduction of your work, and particularly with the focus on cities, and also maybe possibly the new book that has been, I think, recently released on urbanization and climate co-benefits, implementation of win-win interventions in cities.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to be here with you. It's my pleasure. I hope we're going to have very good discussion with the young researchers. I've been around for quite a while. I started thinking about this in Rio 92, because I'm originally from Rio, my hometown where the big conference happened. And then when I started getting involved, because I was already involved in some work in NGO at that time, I was very young at that time. And after that, I started pursuing my career. I was originally an engineer. I work in an oil company, and then I decided to actually pursue my career in this area in sustainable development, and I start getting the degrees. And also start doing more work related to sustainable development. in the 1990s. But recently, in the last 15 years, I'm very involved with more local governance, because in the beginning I thought, the solutions would come with science, science and information. People just get through it knowing what's happening, take action. But actually, I think that science, and this is important for the scientists. A lot of people talk about science policy, and they think the policymaker, they don't understand science. But I think the other way around is more true. The scientists don't understand policy and politics. And I think science is important, but it's not sufficient to make things happen, and then see how we fit the science in the context. And also I start realizing that all these big UN meetings, I work for the UN. I thought I could go to UN and do work, but basically the UN doesn't have the arms to do things, very small, and also very inefficient and to do things. And the things need to happen at the local level. And I start working more, particularly, Seth said, state actors. Some people consider the cities also non-state actors, but actually they are state actors, a part of the state, the governments of the cities. And then I start looking more at how things actually happen on the ground and what you need to do in order to provide information. Science, I think, is much more effective having this information to cities, to NGOs, to companies than actually to national governments and the UN, because in the end, a lot of implementation happens at city level, at the local level. And then you need to know how you link what's happening at local level with what is needed to solve global problems. And then this has been the topic of my research for the next 15 years, to try to link local actions with global needs, global problems, particularly climate change and biodiversity. And I start looking I did this research, a 5-year research on climate co-benefits, and how you actually tackle climate change and at the same time have development benefits, at local level, energy savings, jobs, energy security, a lot of things that can help also to solve local problems. And particularly in developing countries, why I asked my book. I have actually 2 books. One book by Routledge on a more general, is like several case studies around the world. And you have one specific book that just came out this year through Springer about Indian cities, in the case of India, particular India. And you look at Indian cities and how these co-benefits could be an alternative for urban development in India. That's the next big generation of urbanization. It's coming from China, and now it's India and Africa, the 2 big areas of urbanization. Why this is important, I think, and this is the big difference, because if the cities in developing countries, the countries that, and there are a big correlation between development, income or any human development index, and urbanization. In general, more urbanized countries, they are more developed. And it means the countries that are urbanizing now, they are developing countries. And the big question is if they follow the same path as the cities in Europe and the United States in terms of consumption, pollution, is going to be a global disaster, because they actually have a much larger population and much larger degree of unprecedented urbanization. Just to give you an idea, in the last 20 years, 1 billion people in Asia alone moved to the cities. And this is more than twice the whole population of Western Europe. And China, for example, today has around 150 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. Western Europe has less than 20. It means the degree of urbanization is unprecedented. And then many of the cities that follow on the same path, in terms of consumption, in case of urban development as the cities in those countries, but much larger scale. And now expect another 1 billion people moving to the cities in Asia alone in the next 20 years, and maybe 500 million in Africa. It means it'll be huge, unprecedented movement of people, and also in terms of consumption and production and pollution. See, if those cities, they don't follow a different path of urbanization, you're going to be in a big problem in 20 years. This is why the co-benefits are trying to, tunnel through the problems that the city in the West suffer in the past, that you can learn from that and avoid the same problems. So this is why I'm very interested in cities, particularly in areas with high urbanization, or cities that still have a lot of urban problems in terms of infrastructure and service, and they need to solve this problem. But at the same time, the implementation agenda should be different, because now, also there are also global problems, and they need to tackle both problems at the same time. And this is why I'm interested. I'm just starting this Belmont Forum project on water, food, energy nexus in cities. And I started the last 3 years. Even I know Rodrigo Belenzoni is in he's one of our new researchers in the project. And you try to look at more specific in this thing, because you're going to have huge demand for water, food and energy in the cities, and these and in an unprecedented scale, because also you need to have much larger scale of consumption. The cities are consuming much more than what, for example, in India, and people in the rural areas pretty much self-sufficient. But when they move to cities, they depend on things come from outside. And also they start consuming a scale much larger than what they were consuming when in the rural areas. And in terms of climate change, for example, rural areas in India sometimes have negative impact. They're sinks of climate change. But when you move to the cities, some cities in India like Delhi, per capita is already the level of cities in the West. Some cities in the West, they start consuming much more and polluting much more. I think this transition of rural to urban is also how to make this transition in a sustainable way. And that's why I'm interested in those issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. That's very, very interesting to hear. And I think we will get back to some of these things that you already touched upon a little bit in the next questions. And we want to get first a little bit go back to the science. So maybe Seth, we would be very curious to know how do you see the role of currently the science-based information about climate change in the policy making, and how can this be enhanced in the future? Because how is this science really connected to policy currently, and what can we do to further strengthen this interaction? And I think your new project and agenda would very fit into this also.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And Jose said something that I really agree with quite a lot, that I don't think I agree with him that I don't think there's as many scientists that understand politics and policies, not the other way around, as he said it. And I didn't realize that until recently. I've been working for, the first decade of my career, I was a private consultant, mostly in the US, to federal, state, regional governments like FEMA, NOAA, EPA. And then the last 10 years on the NGO side. On the NGO side, it was all focused on the politics and getting mayors to be aware of climate change, to be aware of their role, politically, motivating and lobbying the UNFCCC, the UN, private philanthropy, national governments. It was all policy and all politics. And we make great inroads there, but it wasn't until I got much more heavily involved with the academic community. And to be clear, what's interesting about me joining this call is that I'm not an academic. I have a bachelor's. I never went back to school. But I've been bridging this very, very interesting space between understanding and working in science. My bachelor's was in environmental science and geology, but then working in the policy and the practitioner community. So I basically worked with engineers for the first decade of my career and politicians for the second decade of my career. So I'm one of those people that was kind of an expert in a lot of things, but were good at a lot of things, but not an expert in anything, but bridging that divide. And in the last couple of years, I got much more heavily involved with academia. And I hadn't before because I was working on things that had speed and aggressiveness, and it was very hard to partner with academia because of the slowness and rigor with which that process works. But in the last couple of years, I had a couple of big epiphanies, and the first one for me, not for others, is my realization. And I'd been thinking about capacity building. So how do we enable cities to tackle climate change? You think about it through finance. You think it through how many staff they have. You think about through the 2 to 4 year political cycle of mayoral cabinets and terms. You think about how long it takes to build a bridge or a tunnel. I had never thought about the capacity in terms of the science-based knowledge in cities. Never thought about that until about 2 years ago. And at that point, I was struggling with providing information in cities with the science, right? I was struggling with how do we get the science at a localized scale that's useful enough to enable policy in a city. So that climate models, global climate models, general science about oceans, it's not really helpful to a city at the scale that they need, which is I want to build a bridge or a tunnel or I want to put in a bike lane. You've got to convince the public, you've got to convince city council, you've got to have enough information and data to get the financing for it, and then you've got to implement it. And there was just a lack of that, the data at the level required. As I started digging through this, I did a little interesting exercise, and I started looking at the C40 cities. About that time, we had about 90 of the world's largest cities in C40. And I looked at the cities that had 3 or more, basically colleges or universities, second-tier academics within their geopolitical boundary. And that was the threshold I found. So the cities that had 3 or more within their city had really robust climate action plans, goals and targets, and had a pretty much solid footing. The cities that had 2 or less didn't have plans, didn't have goals and targets, or didn't have any kind of integration associated with them. That's kind of the light bulb went off. I was like, oh my goodness, we have a major problem in the world about where knowledge is getting generated. And also going back to Jose's earlier point too, we have a big issue where the global north has to rapidly decarbonize, but even a bigger issue in that the rapidly urbanizing areas, which is mostly global south, we have to make sure those cities grow and develop in a way that is low carbon, right? They already have a low carbon footprint. We need to make sure that they industrialize and build themselves out in a way that is a low carbon and doesn't follow the last 100 years, 200 years of urban development in kind of the West or global north. But there's also much fewer universities in the global south. And when you look at the amount, and then I started, well, how long does it take to create a university? It takes 30 to 100 years with a lot of funding. And then you look at where the knowledge is and the academics are and where that information is going, and we got a big gap. So I was quite so struck that I pivoted what I was doing and veered away from the policy, to Jose's point, into the science. Instead of been working with academics around the world to try to help them understand the urgency, the politics, what needs to get said and how. And it's been a fascinating journey for me, because a lot of that is very, very uncomfortable to scientists. That scientists don't want to be told, here's a problem, now go research it. They want to have an exploratory process to uncover the truth in a very rigorous, unbiased way. But also at the same time is the speed. So, a city might have a problem and they need to understand about bringing back or restoring a wetland or an estuary on a coastal city, for example. And they got to take a decision on policy and funding in 6 months. And you go to the academic community and say, hey, we need as much help as we can get. And we've got to just put this in front of council in like 4 months. And academia just kind of laughs. Are you kidding me? 4 months? I can't get funding or pull students off or do anything that's anywhere level, anywhere rigorous enough that would pass muster. And a lot of academics, their careers are based on themselves individually, what they've published or being able to get published. Working with cities, a lot of times you can't publish information, the intellectual property rights or what's able to be legally out in it. So there's a lot of limitations there. So I think it's a fascinating time to be involved in this. And at the same time, cities are more increasingly being aware of how important the science is. Because also something that Jose is focusing on, which is the co-benefits, has become a bigger and bigger issue, right? Cities have to tackle a bunch of things simultaneously. you know, and why I talk about why I've been working with cities for so long is that it's not that they are so, you know, environmentally passionate. It's just that they're the world's greatest pragmatists. They have to get shit done. If a city doesn't take garbage out for a week, it's a full-on disaster, like disease, death. The city shuts down. That's just taking the garbage out, okay? So cities have to juggle all of these things. And what makes them phenomenal kind of environmental stewards is when they feel the impacts of climate change, they have to do something about it. They're not debating it. So it's a very exciting kind of medium with which to get things done. But at the same time, they realize because of these competing issues of security, health, garbage, transportation, the environment, they have to have a much more articulate argument to their public and why they're spending the money. So why am I prioritizing something over climate change versus something over education, right? So the co-benefits is a hugely important thing to understand. These things are all integrated. You can't do one without the other. And these prioritizations actually are quite integrated. But it's beginning harder because a lot of what's been happening in cities around the world for the last decade is they've been tackling what they call the low-hanging fruit, right? So, okay, I can get that maybe I need more biking lanes because that cuts down on air pollution, right? Nothing to do with climate change, right? Air pollution. And then if there's less asthma and people can actually breathe, so we got to get people out of cars, which means I have to have other modes of transportation. So they get things like that. But once you start tackling that low-hanging fruit, it becomes much more difficult to do really ambitious and long-term planning because mayors think in 4-year cycles, not 30-year planning horizons. Now, departments like planning, et cetera, do think in longer-term horizons, but you got to meet up the political cycle with long-term planning, and then you got to justify how you're spending your annual budget and what you're prioritizing. So in that sense, science is hugely important, and cities have been very clear and very vocal, practically begging to organizations like C40 and other city networks, you have to help us provide the base evidence of why action is urgent. And now climate change is actually doing that in a way that never could, because we're far beyond the 11th hour of taking action. We've delayed action on climate change to the point that we are on the brink of catastrophic decisions and impacts around the world. And mayors get this. So if we can help articulate the science of the urgency, that it is a global commons problem, but that it will only be solved at the local level, it helps mayors and politicians articulate to citizens, we have to prioritize these actions and or be far more ambitious than we thought because there is a bigger issue that we need to all collectively solve. So it helps support a decision by the director of sustainability or the director of transport or the mayor, him or herself, in making those arguments because they've got science, impartial science that is consensus driven in the background to substantiate those actions. And before they didn't have them. And it's critically important that we do that. And it's critically important that we work with academia in figuring out how to generate not just the information or the science at the scale that's needed, but at the speed that's needed. Because cities are increasingly having to take actions. And as the impacts of severe weather, sea level rise, heat, drought, continue to become more exacerbated and more extreme, cities will take action. And they will take action whether they have the information at hand or not. They will be forced to take action. So what we're talking about is cities around the world taking action based on really good information or not very good information. Either way, they will take action. So we need to rapidly increase the speed with which we are generating the information at the scale that's required. And again, that is unprecedented. Going back to Jose's point, urbanization, the scale is unprecedented. The rate of climate change is unprecedented. Thereby, nothing we've been doing will meet that need. We need to come up with new mechanisms, new models, and new processes with which to do this. And that's where I've devoted the last 2 years of my career, and I'll probably be spending a lot more going forward, trying to figure out this interface between science and policy, because it's such a critical juncture.
Thank you so much, Seth. I think this really outlines some really nice barriers that we face, like the lack of data, the models that are not maybe appropriate at the local skills that you see where knowledge is created. You also see better climate plans and policies, and therefore maybe some lack in developing countries, the challenge of the different time frames of planning, politicians and science production, that scientists might have not really the adequate focus, mainly on publishing and not really making it relevant directly. and also the governance issues that are very competing, like health, economy, education, etc. Then I would like to ask maybe Jose to, if it's possible, like we have here a big set of more maybe barriers, and I think Seth already outlined that it's the knowledge production process should be more focused towards city, or like tailoring the needs of cities, but also should be speed up. But maybe is there a possibility that you give maybe more a local example that actually this has been working well, that these kind of barriers might have been overcome or partly overcome on a local scale in a case study that you researched, or kind of in a co-beneficial way?
Okay. I tried to give you some examples, but first, most of the cases, I think almost all of the cases we studied, they saw some co-benefits. Climate change was not the only driver, and I would say not the main driver of change. As Seth said, particularly cities in developing countries, even developed countries, is not
absolutely
pay your taxes or increase property tax to do this and that. This is basically a death penalty in terms of election. If you say increase your tax 20% because you want to be green, you don't get elected. The mayors know this. They know there is a constituency, maybe a small one, that is very aware of this. But most of people, they are interested, but they don't want, increase their taxes or create burdens. For example, why would just say people cannot use cars? Because if you do these, you'll be removed from office next day, because it's not politically sustainable anywhere. In the modern world. And then the only way you can do this is actually you have something that's important for climate change, and then you link this with other needs of cities. And I can give you a couple of examples. One of the examples I'll give you from one more developed and developing country. One example I worked was in Tokyo. Tokyo metropolitan government is the capital of Japan. They were the first city in the world to have a cap and trade system for greenhouse gases that include buildings. They're the first one that had that, because they said the buildings are the main drivers. And the main reason for that, and it was proved by, they just started, it took 10 years until they had the proper legal system in place to start the system. First, they move, you have to, every building needs to have energy plan, and you need to get more efficient, because the main issue in Tokyo was energy security, because they know that all the electricity they have, the energy they have, comes from outside. And Japan, as you know, even recently this week had a lot of natural disaster. And what happened is when had Fukushima in 2011, and then a big response, particularly from Tokyo, because the buildings were already ready to tackle issues related to energy efficiency. Because next day, all the power plants, nuclear power plants in Japan were shut down, and the buildings that had this system in place, those that survived, and then became very popular in terms of how you actually have this science in showing that you need to get more efficient, and how much you need to get more efficient in order to both having the energy you need for doing our service, and also to tackle climate change, and also have this energy security that you need in order to operate even when you have these big disasters. And after that, a lot of buildings, actually, there was a boom in kind of green buildings, buildings that, are self-sufficient in energy in all aspects. And also a lot of support, because in the beginning, particularly the business community, would say, okay, all the businesses are moving out from Tokyo because the cities next door, Yokohama, others, they don't have these restrictions. But actually, energy became much more expensive all over Japan. And the buildings that were more efficient, that were those in Tokyo, actually start attracting a lot of companies to Tokyo, because now they save a lot of money with energy when they move to a building that's much more efficient. And this is one example. Another example I could give you is in terms of landfills in Brazil. In Brazil was until you started the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, the carbon credit system. Not many cities had proper landfills. Very few cities actually had proper landfills. One of the problems was the finance of it. And then a series of studies done by Brazilian scholars. They actually found out that this new carbon credit system, carbon trading system, could be the solution for the landfills finance. And then a lot of cities start develop landfills and selling the carbon credits to companies or governments abroad, and getting the finance they need actually to operate, and sometimes to finance the building of the landfill upfront with those credits. I work in a couple of those projects. One of those projects that's very well known is Bandeirantes landfills in São Paulo, the city of São Paulo. Probably São Paulo was the largest cities in the world, is one of the largest landfills in the world. And then they start to capture the methane, and with this methane burning it and get the carbon credit. And with these, they create a fund, the environmental fund of the city of São Paulo, that today has millions and millions of dollars. And this fund actually helps to not only climate change, but any environmental issues in the city, like conservation of parks, buying land that's important for certain kinds of biodiversity aspects and so on. And then you created, and these were all because the scientists, they had information, they showed, the politicians were not even aware that this existed, but with all the information they had, the politicians start get interested. As I said, it's not only science, but people start knowing it and start knowing more, and then suddenly, there's all these opportunities coming, and they were much more prepared in terms of information to deal with that. And then I think comes through a lot of issues. I can talk more, but maybe the next questions is issue about timing, about information. Right now, I'm in Cambridge in the United States, in Massachusetts, and they have a cooperation with the local university, MIT, to deal with adaptation, climate change, flooding particularly. And it's very interesting because they know the areas that is going to be flooded more likely in the future, but they cannot release these because real estate price, and people could sue the city. They say, okay, here it'll be flood in 2030. People kind of, they need to have much more, they need to be much more careful in releasing the information from science, because this could have a big backlash. People could sue the city, companies and landowners. And now is it, they know where the thing is going to happen, but they cannot release the information because this could affect the real estate prices and have a big backlash. And this discussing how they are going to make it more public, the people are aware, because it's also in terms of risk, but at the same time, they need to be careful not to step in a terrain that they could have a lot of legal problems. And this, maybe we could discuss this and other issues later on.
Thank you so much, Jose. It's very interesting to hear some more localized ways to deal with these issues. And I think maybe I would like to ask the attendees to think of some questions, and please pose them or to everyone or to me or Atulia. So then we can collect them and start to ask some questions. So please type your question in the box, and then I will ask one question in the meantime, more focused on the careers of Seth and Jose. Maybe you can try to make a really concise, short answer. Then we still have some questions, some time for questions from all the attendees of the webinar. So I would like to go a little bit more into detail of your careers, and maybe you can like highlight maybe a defining moment in your career that led you where you are today, or maybe a biggest lesson learned in the science policy interface, that would be very nice to get some more grasp on these kind of issues for young researchers and practitioners.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mentioned one already, which is a few years ago when I realized the kind of the policy science issue and the capacity side. Maybe earlier on, similar to Jose, actually, I had an opportunity to go work in the oil industry, and I didn't. That was a lucky decision for me, and started working in New York City on various city contracts. But I guess what I got frustrated with at that point was the rate of innovation in terms of environmental policy was very, very slow. So in a place like New York or in other cities, real estate is one of the largest drivers. So nothing eclipses the requirement for real estate development. And I was a hazardous waste expert. And I worked a lot on emergency response. So the combination of seeing that all the policies as an environmentalist that I worked on they were very cut and dry. So you dug a hole, you tested it, and as soon as it passed a certain limit, you were done. You threw the dirt in a landfill, you backfilled with urban fill, and you went. There's no bioremediation. No, it was just get it to the legal permissible limits and then do what you need to do. And then on the emergency response side, I just got really burnt out after responding to things like 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and it was all responding to a disaster. There was no preparatory work, no advanced planning. So as associated with those two, I made a big decision, and I built up quite a big department in the private sector in my company. I cashed it all in and said I wanted to create a new division on renewable energy, carbon management, and energy efficiency. And it was a very, in hindsight, maybe a very brash decision, because I basically was a partner at this firm when I was 30, so I was the youngest partner ever, and I gave away all of my billability to my department to set up this new thing, and I had 6 months of runway of overhead to do it, but it was profitable in 5 months, and I took it to be one of the leading profit centers in 2 years. So it was a huge gamble, but it totally changed my career. And got me in a much more forward-looking role. And because of those risks, I got noticed by the Clinton Foundation. The Clinton Foundation hired me and asked me to create another visionary program called the Climate Positive Development Program, which is looking at turning large-scale mixed residential commercial real estate enterprise projects in cities into carbon sinks. Another totally crazy project. And I made another big gamble because it was so outlandish and so far-fetched. Everybody thought it was a joke and just a big advocacy stunt. And a lot of people said, you shouldn't do that. It's going to really hurt your career, and it's not going to work. It did work. We got 18 projects all over the world, representing about $8 billion of investment capital, and kind of broke the mold in terms of how you can think about doing public-private partnerships. And then I took a big risk again and left to create C40. Which there was a lot of city networks. C40 was already existing. There was lots of political issues about how it was running. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it. And 6 years later, we were growing by 30%, had 95 of the world's largest cities, and became a big powerhouse in terms of both the politics and the science. So I guess my simple message is believe in what you're doing and be aggressive about it. And it might not pay off. There's been lots of mistakes, but the only reason I get to do really, really cool stuff is that because I've taken risks at every step of the way to do it and have been very committed and passionate about it. So that's what I would say. You guys all kind of need to follow your own gut, your own heart in what you're doing, what you're researching, how you're applying yourself. Sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't, but at least that's led me to never have regrets.
Great, many thanks. That's very inspiring to hear. And maybe we can take up the question from Hannah Moosberger to Jose then. Is there something in your career that you wished you had done differently, or something that you wish the generation after you will do differently? So maybe you can elaborate a bit on this question, and more questions are very welcomed to ask on
Uh, okay. Well, it's difficult to say that I would do something differently. Because if I did something different, maybe I didn't know where I would be today. And then it's kind of, I think I don't regret anything. Because what I started as an engineer. And I think what Seth said about doing what you think that's right, what you like, because in general, when you do something well because you like it, is why you do well. If you don't like it, and it's better, go and do something different, because your career is like path dependent on what you start doing. If you start doing something and 10 years later you decide, no, I don't like this, I want to do something different, probably is going to be much more difficult than what you had done if you had thought about these like 10 years before. That's why it's important you do start doing what you like. Even sometimes you have trade-offs in terms of salary. For example, my highest salary actually was when I was working in the oil industry. It was a boom in oil. And that was my highest salary ever. I haven't, even the UN, in other jobs, I didn't get as much as when I was working in the oil industry. But at the same time, I was not happy. I said, make a lot of money. And so maybe I just started my career after college. I worked before college, but it was the first job after college. I said, get some money, giving us some, and this is important sometimes, you make some sacrifice. Maybe 1 year, 2 years, you work hard and they kind of get some money and give you some caution to take risks, as Seth said. Sometimes have to take risks. And then when you're adult, you need to have some money. If it doesn't work, 1 year, 2 years, you move back to another direction. But you need to have some caution of money. And then it gave me the opportunity to start exploring other things. And then I said, I'm going to dedicate myself to sustainable development because I think I like it. And there was also a new thing in Rio 92 just starting, and I start moving in this direction. Same time I had a big change because I thought that science, at that time, science was hard science, would solve the problems. People now you don't have, because you don't know anything about climate change, and then it's why you don't solve the problem. But later on, I was seeing more information, more science coming on. And then I realized that science alone will not solve the problem. People don't take decisions based only on science. And I start moving more towards social science. I said, the hard science is important, but if you don't know how decisions are made, the politics of it, how the structure of the state and companies, organizationally, they make the decisions, is very difficult to understand or to make changes on that. And I start from the hard science, I start moving more towards social science, and also try to get more interested in things that are important for making decisions. And and science is one of them, information is one of them, but it's not the only one. And that's why I end up in the political economy, kind of the political economy, because a lot of this change actually, I like co-benefits, as Seth said, is low-hanging fruits, but made money of the change to really tackle effective climate change, there is going to be a lot of losers and winners. And the political economy is exactly the losers who try to prevent that this happen. And then it's kind of how you actually made a process that you can, go and try to tackle those oppositions in terms that don't have major conflicts, but at the same time, you try to make the change and the speeds that are needed. And then it's kind of a big thing. But in terms of career, I don't actually have any major, complaints that I would do something differently. I think I've done what I like it. there are a lot of mistakes in the process, but you know, I will not, and you learn from the mistakes. The thing is, you don't learn from the mistakes. It's important this, you do things that you like and you have mistakes, you kind of learn from the mistakes, and maybe the next time you're going to do better. And this is, I would say my advice, you know, just try to pursue what you think that is right, and also something that you like, and try to get the skills and get the experience you need to be successful in whatever career you pursue in whatever area, you know?
Thank you so much, Jose. We got another question from Jay Pocklington. And then I think we might have a last question after that from Rodrigo. So maybe we can try to not elaborate too long so we can quit exactly on the hour. But Jay is asking Seth if he could maybe expand on the different incentive structures of those producing the research, so the people in academia, and those using it, so practitioners or policymakers, etc. And because the use of the research remains a black box, and we as academics might view it a bit naively. So he would be wondering if you could expand a little bit more on this point, Seth. Maybe what to do about it, I guess, or how we can tackle this.
Oh man, that's a good question. Well, I'll try to be brief, and I have my point of view, but I'd love to hear Jose's from this as a practicing academic as well. And I'll make my statements will probably be overly generalized, but I don't think, Jay, that you can underestimate how little academic research is cared about or utilized in politics. They don't care, and they don't read it at all. They don't care how many number of citations you have. They don't care what journal it was published in. They just don't give a rat's ass, and they're not going to read it. What they will trust is an individual that they trust to translate it for them. They're not going to look at it or read it. So most people, most politicians who understand the importance of it, which isn't all of them, will have somebody like me who can go in there and understand that community and say, hey, this is what you got to do and this is why you got to do it. They will not talk to an academic because you can't, I'm saying you, generalizing again, academics can't even speak in a language that's understandable to them. They use jargon, they use acronyms, they use science terms. They don't understand them. So you really need, like, I think all of you, I love it. Jose nailed it in the beginning of this presentation. More people on the academic side, if you care about it getting implemented, not being on a shelf or not getting cited. If you care about your work getting implemented, you need to care about politics. A lot of that is about timing, when you do something and who you give it to and how much you spend your time translating it for another audience. Those are the key ingredients. If you don't do that, it won't get looked at, it won't get read by that group. But Jose, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the incentive structures are very different. Even for the same person, I know people who are in academia and they behave in a certain way, and they move to government and they start behaving differently because there are these incentives to, you know, promotion, to survive in politics are very different. And they start doing even things. You have one president, Cardoso, was an academic, Fernando Cardoso, and he was very well-known sociologist worldwide. He said, you know, don't read what I wrote like 20, 30 years ago. Now I'm president, you know, I'm not academic. I'm not writing about president. He said, don't forget what I wrote. He said this when he was, because basically this, he has to deal with all the demands from policy, really different incentives. Academics today have a big incentive is to publish these high impact journals that politicians, they don't read because they don't even have access. You know, we have to pay to get access to those journals, thousands of dollars, you know, they don't have this money. And they don't care to impact in practice, even though now an incentives for promotion in a lot of universities like this, you know, your publications, teaching, the impacts outside is you discussing this where I work. But it's very difficult to measure. How are you going to measure, you know, impact of a research? You know, how many likes in your Facebook or how many people cite you outside academia? It's very difficult to measure. I think the academics, they have very now patronized autometrics, you know, how we measure research and how you qualify. And the politicians, the other way around, is politics, you know, they need to get votes, they need to get popular, you know, have to a lot of values. Seth, for example, climate change even, you can imagine, I was reading in the US, how many cities here, they don't teach Darwinism because the mayors, the people there don't think is science, you know, like you should teach the creationists that people were born by Adam and things like, and they were going to talk about climate change with these people is kind of no rationality. They will not do anything. There are a lot of politics values involved. I think the politicians need to know this more. And now there is a very strong area on academia in political science and sociology, evidence-based.
Yeah.
Particularly in health. A lot of people are doing this work in health, like smoking, cancer-related substance, how this actually influence policy. I'm going to send you now the links to an open access book by Professor Justin Parkhurst from London School of Economics. It's open access, you know, the politics of evidence, from evidence-based policy to good governance. And this is very interesting in the area of health, how he shows when and how science can have a larger impact in politics. A lot of time doesn't depend on the scientists, you know, it's just on them.
Couple of quick things to add. I know we want to do another question, so I'll be really quick. But so I think both systems need to change their incentive structure, full stop, right? Cities do, academia do. So on the city side, one of the things we're starting to advocate for is a director of science in cities. So 20 years ago, cities didn't have a director of sustainability. There's a director of not even a director of the environment. That stuff was held, you know, air quality and water and soil is kind of what you looked at. So there was a big movement in terms of directors of sustainability. About 5-10 years ago, there was a big movement across cities to get a director of innovation or technology or data, right? The next thing I'm trying to help push is there needs to be a director of science. You do need to have an official person or a department helping receive and translate information in science for the city. So they need to change that and incorporate that. On the academic side, there needs to be more cross-disciplinary studies and programs in universities. We need to provide, exactly what Jose was saying, metrics and incentives so that an academic can find a career in an implementation focused and an applied science focused way that isn't just research in a lab and or citations and or teaching. So we need to figure out how to provide incentives to them. And one of the other things that we're working on right now is that there is, you know, we need to stimulate academics to care about what's happening in cities and urban areas. There's no platforms to do that. So a national government can have a national science foundation because a national government has some broader mandate. They can knight you. I now hereby give you the authority to be an entity, right? A city can do that at a city level. Jose was talking about some of those. You're seeing those replicate, but those are wealthier cities that have multiple universities that I was talking about earlier. If you do that, you can have a blue ribbon commission and bring the universities together in a couple of departments, and it's very cool stuff. But if you're not a city in that category, you can't. So one of the things we're working on is trying to create something like an International Academy of Sciences for cities. Let's take the world-leading institutions from around the world, put them together on behalf of city organizations like C40 and GCOM that do have some authority in gravitas, and give them a mandate and give them some funding. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do to switch some of these dynamics. And then the last thing I would tell you about is something I created called the Coalition for Urban Transitions. It's a spinoff from the New Climate Economy. And we went out to create a multidisciplinary approach to generation of knowledge. So we brought in universities, we brought in private sector companies, we brought in consulting firms like McKinsey, and we brought in NGOs. So we smashed them all up together. There's 22 of them. And then we paired them up. So we said, you're good on this, this, and this. But that was pairing an academic with a PwC kind of type of firm. And it's super uncomfortable, super awkward, lots of pain. But the most exciting research is coming out of it because we're forcing people out of their respective comfort zones with different perspectives on the same expertise topic. And it's unbelievable stuff. And I'm guessing that you're going to see more and more of those. And I would encourage all of you to actively seek out multidisciplinary processes or multi-governance approaches to governance. Whether you've got to be a researcher there and get involved, because I believe that's going to be the way forward.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very inspiring ending. We indeed have still one question from Rodrigo Bellezzoni. This might be a little bit mean, but I'm going to ask really, really shortly to answer it with maybe one word or one or two sentences. And he's asking, how do you see future, in exclamation marks, carbon pricing initiatives impacting the development of cities? Is it a burden or are it opportunities?
Burden, I'm going to just dodge that question by saying it doesn't matter whether it's a burden or not. It's happening. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen system-wide. So it's not just going to be on cities. There will be carbon pricing. It's going to be a last-ditch effort of the world to try to regulate carbon emissions through the existing economic structure so it doesn't collapse. So there's going to be lots of winners and losers. I personally don't believe it's going to work. I think there is going to be a total overhaul of the world economic systems, because the economic rate of return and growth that's expected and embedded across banks, institutions, stock markets will not survive. We cannot continue to have the same rate of economic growth, which is primarily driven off of rates of resource extraction. It cannot maintain itself. It will not. So I think you'll see lots of things in the interim in the next decade or two where we're trying to hold together the world's economic model, which is totally tied together for better or for worse now. And you'll see things like carbon pricing introduced across that to try to create a fair playing field. I don't believe it will work ultimately, or maybe it will work, but there's going to be much more substantial issues that will happen, which is going to have to be a broader capped rate of growth that can be expected around the world, is my opinion. A little inflammatory to end, but you didn't say it. I didn't have much time.
That's a very nice ending. Maybe I think Jose is in contact with Rodrigo in a new project.
Yeah, but I disagree with Seth. I think.
Okay. Please then give a little.
What will happen is not pricing or things like Tokyo, like regulations, and you really have to. And in the end, in the beginning, it's all hard. People don't know, but after that, cities are going to be more efficient. More resource concern, and if it's going to getting much better. You see many examples that in the beginning was hard, like Copenhagen, when they start doing the pedestrian avenues, streets, all business were against, because the cars, they want to just park in front of my shop and shop. But now after that, people are asking to close the streets, for cars, because they said actually it's very good.
When you look at the data from cities doing this, pedestrianizing the streets, business profits go up 10 to 50%. And shocker, it's because people are walking by the stores. We did this in Mexico City. We did this in Copenhagen. Jose is exactly right. You can see once you get past the social construct of the change, the air is cleaner, businesses go up, streets are built for what streets are supposed to be, which is humans, not cars. I mean, it's just going to take some adjusting.
Yeah, but the cities will be very different in the future. I imagine, like in 20 years, 30 years, you see already when I travel to cities they're having to visit for a while, I see how they change for the good, some for the good, some for the bad. But particularly cities that Copenhagen, for example, was there 20 years ago and went there recently, it's very different, much better. I think they can change for the better in all aspects, both climate change, but also all the things that matter for the citizens. I think we need to go in this direction, find this mix. And in the beginning, it's very hard, this change, because a lot of opposition. But over time, when things start happening, getting better, and then people start realizing that they lost a lot of time not doing this before.
I agree. And one last plug, early career researchers, get involved in informal settlements. Cities of the future will not look like they did in the last century. Population and urbanism is rapidly accelerating in informal settlements, self-governed, self-created, and the way with which you bring in a block and lot system, resources, the way we've fundamentally done it for about 500 years is radically changing right now. It's a very exciting space. You need to figure out, cities and governments are trying to figure out, how do you create without ruining the integrity of a community that's self-governing, essentially? How do you then layer in resources in a way that is looks very, very different than what we did in the past? So, and people like me have no idea about it because we've never seen it and never dealt with it in our careers before. You can grow up with learning in those systems, become experts on that, and that will be the future of cities for this century, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great closure. I think it gives us a lot of inspiration to tackle these merging and existing and issues in cities with a lot of novel ideas and transform them into sustainable and resilient cities in many ways. And I think we would have had like another 3, 4, 5 hours to discuss this topic. And I really want to thank Jose and Seth for really good contributions and giving us so many things to think about and to start working on as young researchers, and also sharing some of their experience in their career. So thank you so much, Jose and Seth. That was very, very good. And then I would just quickly like to announce the next webinar that will be on oceans. That will be on the 25th of September. So please spread the word to your colleagues that might be interested in that webinar, and maybe see you there as well. Thank you so much for attending, and thanks so much to the speakers and the organizers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Good luck for
everyone. Guys.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.